Empires don't die with a bang. They die with a whisper that slowly turns into a storm. If you pay attention, you can hear it. The same rhythm repeating through centuries. A pattern so familiar that once you recognize it, every empire appears like a story you've already read. Spain heard the whisper. So did Britain. The Soviet Union tried to drown it out. And now, many argue, the United States stands in the very middle of the same unfolding script. Historians call it the seven-stage collapse pattern. It begins with fire and ambition, and ends with a slow, painful unraveling. But the real shock isn't that nations fall, it's how predictably they follow each step. Spain offers the first cautionary tale. Imagine the 1500s. Caravels slicing through the Atlantic, gold and silver flooding into royal vaults, and a kingdom bursting with confidence. Spain wasn't just rising, it was exploding into global power. The empire believed its wealth was eternal, that rivers of silver from the New World would never stop flowing. But buried within the treasure was the seed of decline. When you rely on gold instead of growth, wealth becomes an illusion. Prices soared, the economy twisted. A shoemaker in Madrid could watch his daily bread double in price within months. Spain didn't notice the rope tightening stage by stage, even as its armies marched across continents. Britain, centuries later, would follow the same rhythm, only louder and grander. The British Empire didn't just stretch across the world, it wrapped the globe like a net. The sun, they said, never set on British territory. And for a time it felt like the empire itself never would. But behind the triumphant speeches and steam engines was another story. Overextension crept in quietly. Maintaining dominance across oceans required money, endless amounts of it. Colonies rebelled, wars drained the treasury, and industries that once made Britain rich began to crumble under new competition. A British minister in the early 20th century looked at the budget and famously muttered, "We are losing an empire, but have not yet found a role." He didn't know it, but he was describing stage 5 of the pattern long before scholars labeled it. The Soviet Union story is stranger still. A superpower that rose at breakneck speed, only to discover that building an empire on fear and bureaucracy is like constructing a palace on sand. For decades, the USSR looked invincible. Rockets in the sky, tanks on parade, spies hidden in every corner of the globe. But behind the steel and spectacle was a decaying system. Basic goods vanished from shelves. Corruption spread like rot. Leaders delivered grand speeches about progress while factories rusted and food lines stretched around city blocks. A Soviet joke from the 1970s captured the mood. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. Humor in the USSR wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. And then one day, the red flag came down from the Kremlin, quietly, almost eerily. An empire that terrified the world dissolved with barely a gunshot. Stage 7 completed, exactly as history predicted. So what exactly is this 7-stage pattern that appears again and again? It begins with the spark. Stage 1, a period of rise and expansion when energy, ambition, and unity propel a nation forward. Everyone believes in the mission. Everyone feels the momentum. Stage 2 follows. Overextension, more territory, more influence, more spending, more debt. Stage 3 brings internal division. Inequality widens, social tension simmers, and unity cracks. Stage 4 is the decay of institutions. Corruption grows, trust collapses, and the systems meant to protect the nation start serving only those in power. Stage 5 is economic decline, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, but always painful. Stage 6 brings crisis, war, revolution, or massive upheaval. And Stage 7 is the end, collapse or transformation. The unsettling part is that Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union all reached these milestones with uncanny precision. The pattern seems less like coincidence and more like gravity. Which brings us to the question that haunts analysts today. Where is the United States on this arc? To understand that, You have to rewind to America's own stage one, the mid-20th century, when factories boomed, innovation soared, and the world looked to the U.S. as both leader and liberator. After World War II, America wasn't just powerful, it was unparalleled. The dollar ruled global trade. American culture filled screens worldwide. People didn't ask if the U.S. would dominate the century. They only asked how long the dominance would last. Then Stage 2 crept in. Military bases across the world, vast defense spending, commitments in every region, wars fought in jungles, deserts, and mountains. Every empire in history has reached the point where influence becomes obligation, and obligation becomes burden. America was no different. Next came Stage 3, internal division. The symptoms appeared gradually at first. The gap between rich and poor widened. Politics grew angrier. Social trust weakened. Researchers today can track a 40-year trend. Neighbors talk less, institutions inspire less confidence, and people increasingly believe the system works only for a select few. Empires rarely crumble from foreign invasion. They decay from within. Stage 4. Institutional decline. Tarsi is harder to see but impossible to ignore once it becomes visible. Partisan gridlock, corruption scandals, agencies accused of incompetence, leaders unable to pass major reforms, citizens arguing not over policies, but over reality itself. When the foundation of trust in a nation fractures, even basic governance becomes a battleground. And this is where many historians argue the United States has entered Stage 5, economic decline paired with loss of global influence. Not total collapse, far from it, but unmistakable weakening. The signs appear in the numbers. A national debt climbing to historic highs. Manufacturing jobs offshored for decades. A middle class squeezed by rising prices. Currency competitors emerging, challenging the once untouchable dollar. Even allies occasionally question America's long-term reliability. But the economic story is only half the picture. Stage 5 also involves geopolitical momentum shifting elsewhere. Britain experienced it when the U.S. rose. The USSR saw it when China modernized. And now, America faces a world where power is dispersing, not to one rival but to many. Yet Stage 5 is not a death sentence. Spain had moments when it could have reformed. Britain reinvented itself and remained globally influential even after losing its empire. The USSR failed not because collapse was inevitable, but because leadership refused to adapt until it was too late. That's what makes the American story so compelling and uncertain. The United States today stands at a crossroads. One path leads to renewal through innovation, reindustrialization, and institutional reform. The other path leads toward Stage 6, crisis. History never repeats word for word, but if patterns are any guide, crisis emerges when nations ignore their warning signs. Spain ignored the inflation, and it swallowed the empire whole. Britain ignored the cost of global dominance until 2 world wars forced dramatic retreat. The Soviet Union ignored the collapse of trust until its own citizens stopped believing their country could survive another year. And here's the twist. Empires rarely understand the stage they are in until it's too late. They mistake warning signs for temporary setbacks. They believe their status is permanent. They convince themselves they are the exception to history. But history has no exceptions. The 7-stage pattern is not prophecy, it's a mirror. It shows nations what happens when ambition becomes arrogance, when wealth becomes inequality, when institutions lose their integrity, and when societies forget that power is not a guarantee, it is a responsibility. So, is the United States truly at Stage 5? The answer depends on who you ask. Some believe America is simply undergoing a cyclical slowdown, soon to be followed by renewed growth. Others argue the country crossed the threshold long ago, and that decline is already accelerating beneath the surface. And then there are those who believe the U.S. will eventually face Stage 6, a major crisis, before rediscovering itself and emerging stronger on the other side. The truth is that empires don't collapse because they are destined to. They collapse because people stop noticing the cracks. They collapse when citizens assume someone else will fix things. They collapse when leaders cling to old methods while the world transforms around them. But the pattern also shows something else, something hopeful. Collapse is not always an end. Sometimes it is a transformation. Britain reinvented its role. Spain rebuilt its democracy. Nations can fall apart and still rise again, reshaped and renewed. The story of the United States is still being written, and whether it follows the footsteps of Spain, Britain, or the USSR depends not on fate, but on choices, the choices of millions. So the question is not just what stage the US is in. The real question is whether America will recognize the whisper before it becomes a storm, or whether it will become the next empire added to the long, predictable, haunting pattern of rise and collapse.